Budget speeches, shattered water glasses and early morning bike rides, just some of the lasting images from this week in federal politics.
Now, starting today, News Breakfast will take a lively look at each parliamentary sitting week by talking to some political elders. We'll get the party line on the week's events, and today we're joined by the former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr. With him, former federal opposition leader John Hewson. Gentlemen, great to talk to you both again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Virginia. Michael.
I didn't like the tag elders.
Yeah, look, I knew you'd rankle at that one. Look, you just have to deal with it, mate. You're no longer a spring chicken, but at least you have a great deal of experience behind you, so you can claim that. And given that experience, budget as vision, whatever happened to that? Can I start with you, Bob Carr?
I don't think you should overstate this budget as vision stuff. I mean, budgets ought to be practical, workmanlike documents. And I think the media gets a bit overexcited by budgets. They're probably more iconic in Australia than any other Western country, as people go through them with a magnifying glass, looking for every shift. I don't think you ought to approach them for vision. You ought to approach them on a much more practical basis than that.
Well, John Hewson, if I could bring you into the conversation, on that basis, do you agree with those who describe and commend Tony Abbott for turning his budget reply speech into nothing short of essentially a campaign speech last night?
Well, I mean, I didn't really expect that he'd do anything else, quite frankly, in the circumstances, and it's unreasonable to imagine that a leader of the opposition would produce an alternative budget in 2 days, take him 2 days to read the voluminous papers that come with the budget. But it is an opportunity that you get a national stage and you use it to your advantage. And I think from that point of view, Tony, look, the budget now is very political, to pick up a point you were making with Bob. I mean, it used to be pretty much an economic statement. Now it's pretty much a political statement. There's a lot of politics, a lot of point scoring from both sides. And Tony was given a platform and he used it. And it didn't surprise me that he called for an election. I mean, that's been his campaign tune since the last election.
There's probably a bit less economic analysis in Tony Abbott's speech than might have been warranted, though. John's right, there's more politics in this than there used to be when budgets were entirely technical fiscal documents. But I think it's probably a not unfair criticism that there was pretty little by way of economic content, fiscal content, in the Abbott speech. He's right to say that you can't expect an alternative budget there. How could you conceivably put that together, as John said, in 2 days, or less than that? But you might have expected a bit more attention to deficit versus surplus, to interest rate projections, and to the greatest challenge in contemporary politics: how do you rein in the ever-expanding cost of government?
I think go ahead, John Hewson.
I was just going to say that I think the budget was particularly vulnerable as an economic document, in the sense that it pinned all its hopes on this sustained resources boom, flooding the government with revenue that would reduce the budget deficit from 50 billion to a small surplus in just 2 years. I mean, that is pretty ambitious economic stuff. And so they were pretty vulnerable. And I think the particular point I'd make is that right now we genuinely do have a two-speed economy. We have the resources sector and related industries just humming along, and the rest of the economy absolutely flat. I don't care whether it's retail or wholesale or construction or education or tourism or manufacturing. They're all flat. And the management of those two parts of our economy are basically ignored in this document, and that is the biggest economic policy challenge right now.
Well, Bob Carr, worthwhile or not, the budget was certainly seen by some Labor hardheads as an attempt to bring a circuit breaker after what has been, most would agree, certainly those within the Labor Party, a pretty horrible couple of weeks, couple of months for the Gillard government. Do you see that circuit breaker having been achieved?
I think the government would be very happy at the tick-off the budget has got from economic commentators and from business. It's unusual to get that degree of warmth these days from the business sector for the programs of the Labor government, but the acknowledgement of what the government's doing on upskilling Australians in preparation for the years of resources activity is very significant. I think it really deserves credit for tackling what's being described as middle-class welfare. The government's got to work hard at selling that, at explaining that, and I think it's got to say, look, governments can bring down the overall tax rate, income tax rate, if we see that we target and discriminate in paying welfare. One great advantage Australia's had historically is that our welfare has been targeted. In Europe, welfare is universal, and that's why you've got those tax rates in Germany and France and Scandinavia, where ordinary working people get over 50% of their income confiscated by the government in very high rates of personal income tax. We can keep personal income tax rates historically lower in Australia, comparatively lower in Australia, but only if you look at these pockets of middle-class welfare that were so beloved of John Howard. John Howard loved taking the income from resources boom, the resources boom revenues, and distributing it in a way that appealed to him. And this government's now starting to rein that in. And I think that could...
Yeah, look, I can agree with that. I think that those two elements, although they're rudimentary at this stage in this budget, I mean, firstly, the movement from welfare to work, they've made a significant start, linking that to training. I think that is a very significant aspect of this budget. They've been bold enough to start that process. There's a long way to go, and if you look at just one statistic, for example, we've got more than 800,000 people on a disability pension of one form or another, and only about 500,000 people unemployed. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with that system. It needs to be addressed. Secondly, as Bob says, the middle-class welfare, what they might sort of say upper middle-class welfare, I mean, that does need to be reined in, and that is those two things are very significant structural challenges which, to give the government credit, they have actually gone out of their way to make a start in both areas.
Well, let's talk about the politics of that a little bit, though, for just a moment, which we were referring to earlier. Tony Abbott has seized on that issue of just what now generally defines, according to the government, a household that has enough money, a combined income of $150,000. Is that an issue that he can actually press on successfully with Australians who feel, well, I don't actually feel that well off, even though our income comes to that? Bob Carr?
The figure is 2%. 2% of families, that is, not even families overall, but families captured by the RBT, only 2% of families sustain this attention in the budget. And I think the government
they're a key voting 2%, aren't they? Isn't that what Tony Abbott's banking on here?
Sorry?
They're a key vote, that 2%. Isn't that what Tony Abbott's banking on?
No, but I think this is politically sustainable. If I were the government, I'd be more worried about other things than this.
Okay.
I think this is politically sustainable, especially given the way the government's doing it, by freezing indexation. And I don't think people are going to notice, as they move into that category, that these benefits aren't flowing to them in the way they were for others a few years earlier. So there's some subtlety about how they're doing it, but I think the principle is absolutely valid. The only way of keeping income tax rates overall as low as we would want them is by extinguishing these over-generous pockets of middle-class welfare that John Howard was so beloved of inserting in his budgets.
OK, well, can I ask that question of John Hewson then? John Hewson, do you think that Tony Abbott's onto a good thing here, saying, hang on, the government's saying that you people are rich enough?
Look, I think he can exploit his concept of class warfare.
Yeah.
Because, and simply because of the circumstances in which these cuts are being made. You know, we used to say it's never a good time to cut into some of these things, and now when cost of living pressures are as significant as they are, I mean, Tony's got an edge in there, and he will exploit that edge, I have no doubt. It's only a small percentage of people, but he'll paint the picture that this is just the beginning. Where else is it going to go? And as Bob says, look, it's not a cut as such. It's just not an increase. And so what they didn't have, they may not miss. But in time, it will require cuts, and he can extrapolate this in the context of people that are really, most people are really struggling. Cash is tight. Obviously, they're not spending. You know, they are saving at record levels now because they are uncertain. It's unusual. Economic relationships we used to take for granted are breaking down. You know, like full employment, you'd expect a bit of a retail boom. full employment, you wouldn't expect so much savings. There are fundamental relationships that are shifted here, and that does give Tony, in political terms, I think, an opportunity to exploit that. And he's very good at exploiting those sort of issues and painting a bigger picture. Start with a little bit and paint the big picture.
Well, John Hewson, I asked Bob Carr about Julia Gillard. I'll ask you about your thoughts on how Tony Abbott is tracking, and I ask that because there are some people within the Liberal Party who still believe that he won't be opposition leader at the next election, replaced by Malcolm Turnbull, possibly within months of the election being called. Will he go the distance?
Yeah, I think he will, and I just point out that there's no shortage of ambition in the Liberal Party. Most of them have got a baton in their knapsack, and they all see themselves as leaders, and if you ask them that question, they might talk about... They might talk about Malcolm Turnbull, but they're really actually talking about themselves. I mean, I think both of them have got a problem. Both of them have got a problem, Gillard and Abbott. Neither of them were liked at the last election, both because of the way they got there and who they were. And now we have a situation where Rudd's out-polling Gillard fairly consistently and Turnbull's out-polling Abbott fairly consistently. So, I mean, they've both got that problem in terms of the electorate's perception of them, and they've both got to build their credibility in that context. And this is what very important for Gillard, to try and get out in front, get on the front foot, start to score some points. But she would have lost a lot of ground last night because Tony was just banging on about the carbon tax and how she deceived the people. And that's a theme he will just run every hour of every day for the rest of his life, I think. But certainly to the next election.
Abbott's doing well, but if Labor's got something on Abbott, it is the notion that he hasn't got alternatives. And even when people in focus groups are saying, "Oh, we think he's got a strong message, we think he's making telling points," that if pressed, they will say, "But we are curious about what he would do in government. Has he got alternatives? Has he got a plan?"